Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Unlock the AI Insights Your Data Holds, Progress Survey Findings. Let's start by quickly introducing to you our speakers for today. Today, we are joined by our speakers, Todd Wright and David Loshin. Todd leads global product marketing for the Progress Data Platform Solutions. He works closely with the product management and sales organizations to create and promote materials that are relevant and valuable to Progress customers. Wright is instrumental in developing customer relationships and creating strategic marketing plans that drive awareness, consideration, education, and demand for Progress. David Loshin, president of Knowledge Integrity Inc., is a recognized thought leader and expert consultant in the area of data strategy, information risk, and information innovation. David is a prolific author regarding information management best practices as the author of numerous books and papers, including Big Data Analytics, from strategic planning to enterprise integration with tools, techniques, NoSQL, and Graph, and the Practitioner's Guide to Data Quality Improvement. David is a frequent invited speaker at conferences, web seminars, and sponsored websites and channels. David is also an associate research engineer at the University of Maryland. I'll now turn it over to David and Todd to start the conversation.
Rachel, thank you very much. And David, it's great to see you again.
Thanks, Todd. I'm real happy to be doing this conversation again. I think you are probably going to give us a preface that talks about how many years we've been doing this survey.
Yep, you read my mind. I believe this is our fourth year now that we've done the survey together. In the previous years, for our audience, it's been strictly around data connectivity, data access. But this year, talking with David and other people at Progress, we decided to expand this survey into more of a holistic view of data management. And of course, AI is the big talk around industries and talk around town. And we decided to bring that part of the survey as well. David, let's jump right into that. AI, it's what everyone is talking about. From business people, IT people, I don't think you can go online or turn your television on today without somebody talking about AI. What's your thoughts on that? And, where are we going as a society, as an industry? Love to get your thoughts on that and go from there.
When you started in there, it made me think, I was going to say cab drivers, or I guess today you'd say Uber and Lyft drivers are talking about AI too. And I remember going back to the dot-com bubble. I remember people saying when cab drivers are giving you investment advice, it's time to start rethinking what your strategy is going to be. So,
yes.
And I think we're getting to that point a little bit in that, and I want to roll back a little bit to something you had said that we had changed the intent of the survey, and really what we did is we had a bunch of conversations when we were putting together the questions for this run, and I think what we were saying was, we've learned a lot of stuff over the last couple of years, the prior years of the survey, about data connectivity in the organization, and we were seeing all these trends about how there's increased distribution of data, there's increased awareness of the utility of data from across a bunch of different areas in the business. But the fact that AI is essentially the 800-pound gorilla is in the room or the elephant in the room. I'm mixing my metaphors there. But we had to address it, and we had to address it from a perspective of not of the same way that everybody else is talking about it, which is how, whatever the latest media hysteria is saying, it's going to, AI is going to replace 90% of the workforce, or AI is going to solve all your problems, but rather, how does an organization look at it from a data architecture standpoint and a data governance standpoint to be able to adequately support the integration of useful AI applications into the environment? And I think that's where we tried to spin our questions for the survey, and to get an idea about, not about, we know everybody's trying AI. We know everybody's using ChatGPT to generate recipes and all that kind of stuff. So that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for uh, core understanding of how individuals are seeing the integration of useful technology from a socio-technical perspective. And I think that kind of is a subtext that ran along not just the questions that we asked, but the answers that we ended up getting.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed, David, is there was a little switch in the market, probably earlier in this year, where it went from everyone talking about all the great things that AI can do for a business, society, and so forth. And it's switched a bit. I wouldn't say there's a pushback on AI, but there's more coordinated and deeper thoughts around how can we actually make this work. And that seems to be where we're at right now of, yeah, we get what AI can do and some of the positive things it can do, but we're struggling to figure out how to start, who needs to be involved, and so forth. And if I could add to that, that's I think one of the big positives for running the survey this year is I think we're meeting the audience where they are right now. And that is, hey, we get the greatness of AI and the potential, but where do we start, David? I mean, that's what I'm seeing. And I'm assume that's what you're seeing as well.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is a couple of weeks ago there was this report that came out from MIT, from a group at MIT that basically was, the bottom line that was the takeaway that everybody seems to have derived from that is that 95% of all AI projects fail. And what's funny is I shared this, I found the report and I was sharing it with somebody I work with who's also, like me, has been around for a while. And I showed it to him and he said, why are we limiting that to AI? I mean, 95% of all projects basically fail, and they all fail for the same reason, which is either they're being motivated by triggers that are not necessarily aligned with how to benefit from that within the business. I mean, a lot of it is, FOMO. There's two CEOs are playing golf, and one talks about how they're implementing AI, and so the other one says, "Okay, well, we got to do it," and then calls up his chief data officer or chief analytics officer, says we got to do that, and then it becomes a game of telephone to where suddenly you've got people are quote unquote doing AI without even realizing why they're doing it or what the intent is. And again, I used the term socio-technical before. I think that's another root cause of failure, which is people don't understand. Well, people in organizations don't understand that technology doesn't solve the problem by itself. It's a combination of an overall systemic perspective that integrates data and technology and process and people, and that you can't engineer out any of those or presume that you can engineer out any of those without affecting the way that the integration of the other parts are going to have any positive results. So from the perspective of the typical, if you want to refer to like the Gartner hype cycle or any kind of expanded expectations for how magical some kind of technology is going to solve all of your problems, and then realizing that just like with every other magic potion that you swallowed, you still had to stir it before you drank it, and that you needed to integrate people into the process, and you need to have some particular business objective, and you need to have some metrics, and you need to have some governance around how the technology is being integrated, dot dot dot, whatever it is that you want to drill down into. And I think that again, like I would go back to the results of the survey, but I mean all of this is inherent, or what's the word, latent inside the results that we got, which is we see a bunch of organizations that are piloting or deploying AI, but are experiencing challenges getting access to data that is quote unquote AI ready.
Yeah, absolutely. And what another thing that I thought was interesting about that report was it was 95% of all pilots. And to me, that's where you are free to fail, free to learn. So yeah, there was a lot of press and a lot of talk about that report. But as you mentioned, like everything else, if you work on the fundamentals first, that's going to get you to where you want to be, as opposed to, there is no plug and play AI for any organization. David, with that said, let's dive a little bit into the actual survey now, and some of the at least what I found were interesting responses that we got. To your point around data governance and data management, one of the categories was data literacy and accessibility. And what we found, and this was similar to past reports as well, 25% of respondents within our survey are only slightly familiar or not familiar at all with their organization's data resources, and what are some of the bigger obstacles preventing full data literacy, and how companies can overcome them. That is one of the biggest problems that we've seen is, yes, you need to have data governance, data management, and of course, you need to have a lot of data for AI to make it as useful as possible. But if we have organizations that are out there and have individual employees that don't even know the data resources they have, and if they do, they don't know how to access them, where do they go from there? And what kind of advice would you have?
So what you're describing is not an uncommon scenario that has been around for a long time. If we go back to the days of reporting and business intelligence tools and being able to build a data warehouse. I mean, all the questions pop up, which are, what's the data that's being sourced for my application, and where's it coming from, and what does it look like, and how do I get access to it? So it's part of an organizational kind of barrier to success in raising awareness about data utility from different resources that are available. Now, the good thing is that today there are so many more applications that are data dependent or data reliant, and there's so many more savvy data users or savvy business users who understand that data is not just the output of some transaction processing system. I think one of the bigger issues, though, is that organizational data architectures are organically evolved, right? So it's like, this every independent business line of business is developing their own application suites and the data that goes into it and the data that comes out of it. But nobody goes into, like startup people don't go into the garage, to build a system that is easy to access the output data that's being logged as a result of running your application. So it's really more a question of what do we mean by data literacy, and and how do we improve those levels of data literacy across the organization so that there is better understanding of the utility of that data. And so questions about data literacy are what are the the data assets that exist, and how are they being described, and what is their structure, and what are who is allowed to look at that data and under what circumstances, and how do you create an interface to be able to make use of it, and what are the conditions under which that data can be used. And these are all what you refer to as metadata, but it's more than just like, okay, here's a database structure, and here's a table with 5 fields in it, and here's the data types of those fields. I mean, it's a lot more comprehensive knowledge, I would say, about the those data assets.
Um, One thing that I've been curious, and I've been wanting to ask you this, David, is I think we both know, and our audience that's listening to this knows as well, that no one has waited for AI to come around to establish any type of data governance or data management practice at their organization. How can they tap into what they've developed already, whether it be for, just data governance from past projects, operational or analytics, maybe even a data governance program they had established for GDPR when it came about, I believe in May of 2018. What can they do with their existing data governance that they have and just repurpose it for AI? Or is that even possible?
So there's two parts to this. One is, how can you repurpose your data governance organizational strategy to supplement your AI use? And the other is, what's missing from the traditional data governance infrastructure that is necessary for AI. So let me jump to the first question, which is every organization has some kind of governance, whether that is a well-defined set of policies and processes, or whether it's a ad hoc collection of, this is the way we do things, and here's what we do when we find an error in some database table. I mean, every organization has to do that somehow. And so there's been 20 plus years of I guess mind warping around data governance. And a large part of that is it's a pile of PowerPoints that I've contributed to as well. And I think that the challenge overall with data governance is that it's not the kind of thing where you can easily motivate an organization to voluntarily constrain themselves. And that's essentially what governance is defining a set of policies and procedures for compliance with those policies. Uh, and it's fine as long as you don't have external pressures, or even internal pressures that are saying governance is necessary. So GDPR is one of those external pressures that made governance necessary, because all of a sudden you have this potential problem, which is somebody outside of the organization is telling me what I may or may not do with my data.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, go ahead.
You had, I hate to cut you off, but you had mentioned the word they don't like to be constrained. Organizations don't. Is it because they feel that it will slow down the innovation that they can, the insights they can get from their data? Is it the cost? Is it just really difficult? Is that some of the
Well,
constraints
no,
they're
no, I
trying to
mean,
avoid, or
no,
all of them?
I'll be blunt, which is like people, look for the path of least resistance
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
to do something. And if doing something, I can do it in two ways. One is I can do a kind of a back channel, get access to what I need to, and without having to abide by some set of filling out forms and making requests. And people are going to do that, because it makes it easier for them to get their job done. Everybody wants to do their job, and I'm not going to hold that against anybody. But if doing your job means, and I'll give here's a contrived example. Somebody works on one system and wants to get access to customer data. Customer data is on another system, and there's no effective way of moving that data from one system to the other system, because some governance constraint says that you're not allowed to move data from one geographic domain to another, or one geopolitical domain, which is like data sovereignty issues, like the data from country A can't be managed in country B. Now,
Yeah.
so somebody's working on that data, and they need to run some kind of analysis, and they need the customer data from three different countries. If they happen to manage to bring a box of cookies over to somebody who's in country A, who is willing to do an extract of the data and put it on a thumb drive and hand it to that person, who can then take that thumb drive and walk out the building. Well, that completely bypasses any governance that exists in the organization. But I'm telling you from experience that people will do that. So So the reason they do that is that they've got job A to do, and governance structure, X says they can't do some part of that process that thereby prevents them from getting the job done. So again, this is the way things are. I'm not saying that it's good or bad.
Just reality,
It's
yeah.
just reality. Yeah.
Yeah. And on the theme of path of least resistance, which you had mentioned, both for orgs and individual employees, despite the growth of hybrid cloud and distributed data, we found within this survey that 73% of organizations still rely heavily on Excel for data sharing. And I mean, why does this still persist? And what can organizations do to really move that towards a more modern approach? Is it more towards the people and processes, David, or is it something external needs to happen? I'd really like to get your thoughts on that, since we're talking about the governance section still, and of course the path of least resistance.
So I mean, I think that's it. It's like everybody has Excel on their desktop.
Yep.
So it's easy to share data in Excel. Well, I should rephrase that. I mean, I'm not trying to denigrate Excel. I think it's a great application.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure that I would necessarily say that it's easy to do things in Excel, but it is a platform that is easily available, that is easily understood by a lot of people. And so it's used if you find a tool that does something and you can manipulate that tool to do something else, then you might just do that. And it's not surprising to me that people a lot of organizations, rely heavily on Excel for data sharing. But its persistence is because it is so ingrained into the enterprise that's the way people think. Like Excel is a mechanism for doing spreadsheets or workbooks that have tabs that are spreadsheets or worksheets. But half the people I talk to who use Excel think of it as a database.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here. How big of an issue will that be for the AI reality that we're currently in and proceeding in? The Excel for data sharing,
Uh,
73%.
I'm gonna guess that the kind of applications that people are building with AI. I mean, the ones that people are most exposed to are chatbot applications, right? So if I could go to like a chat GPT or Claude or one of these, and I could say, I'm going to upload this spreadsheet. I want you to tell me what's the most important statistics that you can derive out of the spreadsheet. I mean, even Microsoft is committing to making use of their own models and Copilot to augment their desktop suites anyway. So, Excel is a structured data framework, and people are getting more acclimated to recognizing that AI systems can make use of both structured and unstructured data in all sorts of different ways. So is it going to be a impediment to success? It'll probably just make things a little more complicated down the road in terms of governance.
Yeah, to continue on some stats and as far as data landscape and architecture, another interesting thing that I thought, and another interesting answers that we got or findings, was only 15% of organizations have adopted a semantic layer, despite the increasing complex hybrid environments that they have and are continuing to develop. What do you think is preventing the broader adoption there? Is it just, what we have talked about so far, just people are happy with what they're using, used to what they're using, or is it a deeper issue as far as using a semantic layer? Do organizations not really understand what it's all about? What are your thoughts on that, David?
So, and I think in the report we actually spend a little bit of time discussing what a semantic layer is and what it does for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the benefits that it provides is a kind of a buffer. This will go back to one of your first questions about data literacy. It provides a buffer between the data users and the data sources, so that what I'd like to be able to do is say, and this feeds into the different types of data architectures that people are adopting anyway, in terms of like data mesh or data fabric or data virtualization, which is where you've got your data sources sitting, in different areas across your enterprise, and being able to provide some unification of those data assets in a way that doesn't force the data user to have to become an expert in 1,000 different kinds of systems. So
Exactly.
the benefit of the semantic layer is that if I want to talk about customer data, I don't want to have to either understand what the customer table in the sales database looks like and the customer table in the customer support database and know the difference, nor do I want to have to navigate the differences associated with definitions, and that a customer support customer may be a different entity than a sales customer. And so the benefit that you get out of a semantic layer is this kind of smoothing of the I'll jump into tech jargon, the hierarchical class or the class hierarchy associated with the entities that are being modeled across your enterprise. And so there are people, and some of those people behave like sales customers sometimes, and then at some other times in the life cycle of their relationship with the organization, they behave as customer support, and sometimes they're employees. So it's like the person who works for the mobile telephone company, and so they're an employee of the mobile phone company, plus they are a customer of the mobile phone company because they're able to buy product maybe at a discount, and then when the product doesn't work right, they call customer support. So their customer support, they play that role as well, and those are different roles in the organization. But if I want to say how many individuals are we dealing with, and under what circumstances, I don't want to have to then start saying, okay, well, now let me go run a query against the customer support database, and then try to take the result. And what typically somebody might do is dump it into Excel, like we were talking about before, and then going to the sales database and running a report and taking that data and then appending it to that same Excel spreadsheet, but rather to say, tell me information about customers. And then, this is where we start, seeing where we can benefit from a organized and governed use of AI applications layered within your data connectivity environment, which is I have a semantic layer which defines the different roles that individuals may play, and I have maybe an AI application that has been trained to be able to differentiate between those different customer types or customer classes under different prompt circumstances. And so if I want to know how many individuals have we sent a statement to, is different than how many people have we provided customer support for, versus how many new customers do we have who purchased a product this past month. You can allow that chatbot, that AI-driven chatbot, to be able to layer on top of the guardrails of that semantic specification of the different entities in the organization, and then I'll use the word intelligently. I mean, no application is intelligent, but within some guidelines, be able to provide a coherent, cobbled together response that makes sense based on the probabilities of the predictive way that the LLMs or the underlying models actually work.
So the one theme that I keep on hearing over and over again, and it hasn't been mentioned by either one of us, is it's all about AI readiness and what it means to be AI ready and have AI ready data. Half the organizations that we polled, they're piloting or deploying AI, but the half say they have challenges accessing AI ready data. And it really makes me, I know that we've touched on different types of issues that organizations are having, people, processes, of course, technology. But in your opinion, David, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to have data that is ready for AI or AI readiness data? What does that actually mean? And is it so different than anything else that they've done in the past?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Yes,
And
it
the
is.
reason
Yeah.
it's complicated is, and and look, you and I have known each other for like 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And we know each other from the data quality space. So like, I can talk about this in the context of data quality, which is the data that I'm going to use for whatever I'm using it for fit for that purpose. So if I want to run a report on how many widgets I sold across the different regions of the United States, I have an expectation that my sales records are not going to have errors in them, such as I sold minus 15 widgets at the cost of 30 cents per widget, and the total for that sale is $250. I mean, there's multiple errors in what I just said, and so data quality is a set of processes that are intended to identify where there might be flaws in the data that would make it not acceptable for use. Now, AI ready is much more complex because let's look at what the scenario is, right? We have looser constraints on the kind of questions that are being asked. So if you look at the whole chatbot style LLM where you prompt it and it provides you a response, and then basically that's the way these models work, is that you provide it with a prompt, and then you expect it to get to respond to you in some way that's based on the data that it was used to train the model. And so these models are trained on, millions and billions of data artifacts, and it's called artificial intelligence. They're not thinking. They are based on different algorithms predicting what the optimal response would be, which is why you get errors, or you get, what do they call them? Hallucinations in the output of some of these models, is because they're just predicting what you think its predictive infrastructure says would be the best response. It doesn't say, oh, it's got to be correct. So these models are driven by pattern analysis of the content that goes in. And so when we talk about AI ready data, if we want to train a model, which typically nobody's going to do other than the big companies, but if you want to fine tune a model, or if you want to provide some guardrails through use of RAG or something like that, if you're using, you still need to have some level of expectation that the results are going to come out in a way that are not flawed. And a flaw in using an AI model is greater, or I shouldn't say it's greater. Its scope is wider than whether I'm calculating a sales total properly or not, because there could be inherent bias in the training data that would lead the response to trend towards biased answers. So, the canonical example of that is some large organization had trained a model to do filtering of resumes based on having fed the resumes of all the staff into the model as training data. And the resumes, because the patterns of most of the people who had been hired were male, it it by virtue of the pattern of there being more males than females, it selectively chose more males over females, as even if you had identical candidates with the identical experience, it would still go to the male one instead of the female one, because its patterns were expecting that male is more likely to be the response than female. So you end up with these embedded biases. You end up with with incorrect data that's being used for training. I mean, here's an example. Wikipedia is an open data source, so AI models are sucking all the data out of Wikipedia. Well, there's
Mhm.
nothing that says that what's in Wikipedia is correct. It's what the organization around Wikipedia has deemed to be content that is acceptable based on their rules. So, I look at Wikipedia pages and I see errors all the time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So now that's been brought into the model. So AI ready data is really a question of trust. And it's not just, so quality is one thing, but trust is different, which is, do I believe that the data that I'm using for my AI system, or that I'm using to prompt the system, or I'm using to fine tune the system, do I trust that it meets some set of trust criteria, like it's believable, it's accurate, it is traceable, that I can, if an AI model tells me an answer, that I've got some way of saying, well, how did you come up with that answer? And those types of things.
You got to my next question. And this is going to be another tough question to answer because it's really going to depend on the organization. But maybe you could give us, the audience, a broad answer on this one. How could that organization that was dealing with resumes and their model gave more emphasis to male applicants, how could that organization catch that before it made it into the press? Is there anything in particular? I'm not going to call it the secret sauce, but is there a secret sauce or anything in particular that any organization can do to avoid that type of situation before it makes it external? And heck, to even limit the amount of damage that's known about it internally.
Well, I think that's a million dollar, the
Yep.
billion-dollar question these days, which is how would I know whether a model is trustworthy if I don't have a
Mhm.
well-defined mechanism for measuring trust? And as you can tell from the 20 years worth of wriggling around the whole data governance question and data quality, I mean, I look at what people are saying about data governance, data quality today. Like if I go to a conference, or I look at the titles of and abstracts of webinars and that sort of thing. I mean, there's literally no difference between what the problems are today and what they were 20 years ago. And that's with, dozens of companies and, startups and technologies all intended to solve this problem. So the problem isn't solvable by throwing more technology at it. And this is one of those things where I think, we need to learn a lesson that AI is not going to replace humans, because you still need humans to be able to oversee what your AI is doing, and how to
Mhm.
optimally make use of it. So this is becomes a really interesting question, which is these companies who are like, 6 months ago they said AI is going to replace 10% of our workforce, and then they're obliged to the shareholders to fire 10% of their people. Well, that AI is not, it's not going to do stuff on its own. It's got to be, it's optimally, it would be, do I have an application that relieves me of my busy work and does that for me, and empowers me to be able to do the work that only humans can do, where the AI is augmenting that process. So, I'll give a concrete example, which is data privacy compliance, because like we were talking about governance before. So you brought up GDPR. So, what does data privacy compliance mean? It's, uh, you know, fundamentally it is, do I, if there's content in a data artifact that is not allowed to be made public because it's got personal information in it, I want to be able to flag that before it gets released. And I can use natural language processing and entity identification and entity extraction. These are all AI and machine learning technologies that I can use to scan content and identify whether there is a representative entity referred to within that content. But I can't tell you whether it is PII that's not releasable automatically. I can only flag it as saying there's content in here that looks like something that somebody might want to look at. So if I've got a big document and it's got your what's it called, your colonoscopy results buried in it somewhere, and it's 1,000 pages long. That's the difference between a person trying to read through 1,000 pages worth of some document that has some medical information buried within it versus having an automated system that can scan 1,000 pages in 3 minutes and highlight every single page that's got a person's name on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting, to your point about talking about data governance, I think I wrote a blog 6 years ago, and the title was Data Governance, the Topic That Never Dies. And I honestly think that I could take that blog word for word and apply it to what we're talking today and industries are going through today. There was another question on the survey, and it's going to lead from what you had just talked about. Most organizations within the survey, and I think we could say that for the industry as a whole, organizations as a whole, most organizations say that AI and data initiatives evolve together, but only 17% of those within our survey know how they actually relate. So we've touched on this a little bit. Maybe we can expand a little bit more here, but how can business leaders, IT leaders better align their data strategy with their AI strategy if they're just looking today? Say, I'm really late. I've been on the golf course with my fellow CEOs, and to your point, and they're all talking about how far along their AI or initiatives are. Whether I believe how successful they are is besides the point. I know that I need to get going on mine. So where do you marry those two together, the data and the AI from the start?
Yeah, I mean, first I would take a deep breath and say those guys are lying, like you said. I mean, really what it is saying when it comes to any kind of, and again, it's just shocking to me that this is not obvious. But like every single time I want to make an investment in some kind of technology that's supposed to solve problems, I better know what my problems are that I want to solve and how I'm going to determine whether the problem is being solved first. So before I start sending a big troop of people to go install, start using some AI model to do a quote unquote pilot. Let me take a step backwards and say, what are the types of things where the integration of this technology is going to provide some real value, and how am I measuring that? And what are the constraint, the negative aspects of this that I need to be looking out for, and then how do I frame that pilot so that it actually could be, that's what I want to do with pilots is I want to fail most of the time so I can find where, instead of wasting a lot of money on it, I just want to waste a little bit of money on a lot of things, find the two or three that actually work and not bother with the rest. So I want to do the same thing here. I want to find, but I want to do this intelligently, which is, where's AI going to help me, and what does the data need to look like to be able to support that application, and what does AI readiness mean for the data, and where's the data sitting, and how many people are familiar with the data? I mean, it all kind of folds together in terms of data literacy and accessibility and the architectural landscape of how I'm getting access to the data and how I'm giving permissions to get access to that data and how I'm streaming that data to where it needs to be and under what circumstances, and what are the constraints that I want to set ahead of or the validation points I want to use for verifying that the data is not skewed towards some kind of bias or is not missing information that's necessary So again, it's like applying the same fundamental governance techniques, but doing it from a business perspective, which is I think I can benefit by I can improve customer service by having a chatbot that can solve 5% of the standard problems without having to get a human involved in a way that is still appealing to the user, to the consumer. How do I do that? As opposed
Yep.
to I'm going to have a chatbot that like will, go crazy and start selling, Mercedes-Benz cars for $50. I just read this article about that, like somebody
And
who,
I'd be fine with that.
yeah, but somebody who had
Yeah.
had convinced through some kind of sales app that was a
Yes. Yes.
chatbot that they were offering $73 for some like $50,000 car. And the
Jeez.
chatbot said, okay, well, it sounds like a deal. Let's
Yeah.
shake on it.
Let's write up the paperwork.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, like what you want to do is figure out that might actually be a problem and say, well, what's the probability that these problems are going to crop up, and how do I put the guardrails around my pilots so that I can tell whether it objectively is going to add value or whether it's just going to create yet another pile of problems that somebody's got to look at.
And then that to my point earlier, and that's exactly why I didn't put a lot of weight into that 95% of failures within pilots. Um, that's a good thing in a lot of ways. That's like you had said, that's where you want to fail. And as long as that, if you're learning within those pilots, it's a good thing. And it makes for an interesting story, but I don't think it's the end all fear of AI that was first reported when it came out maybe about a month and a half ago. But I will say, since we're on the topic of fear, and this is another thing that you've talked about a little bit, there's people that are afraid of job displacement. I think it's a legitimate fear. I'm going to put you on the spot for a third time here. I have a child. He is a sophomore in high school, and he is going to graduate in 2 years, and he wants to go to college. Where would you, if you were his college advisor, where would you steer him? He's a smart kid, loves math, engineering, all those great things, technology. Where could a rising high schooler, soon to be high schooler, or soon to be college student, I should say, where's a good spot for this particular kid?
I mean,
And it's a broad question, very
yeah,
broad.
yeah, that's tough for me to answer. I think, the question here is, what is going to be a discipline that for which I can have a satisfying life when I graduate 6 years from now? And, I'll give you two answers. I'll give you the answer that I've told all my kids, which is uh, you know, find something that you love and become really good at it.
Yeah.
Number one, because you're going to be doing it all day long. So if you don't love doing it, you're going to hate your life.
One
Uh,
third of your waking hours, yeah, or
yeah,
one third of your day, I should
yeah,
say,
1/3 of
yeah.
your day. So that's my basic answer. But I mean, in terms of what I would focus on is is problem solving. which is which is engineering is problem solving, math is problem solving, computer science is problem solving. But the way that students go through these programs is not in terms of of understanding that fundamental, but rather looking at it in terms of achievement, right? I took this course, I did the test, I got an A, I went on to the next course. But if you can't take, unpack a problem and determine, what do I know about how to solve this problem? What do I need to know that I don't know? And how do I learn what I need to know? I think you're going to be stuck because you're always going to be in a position where you're expecting something else is going to come in and solve it. And that is where, we see the same problem over and over again, which is, oh, here's this new technology. If I just buy the technology, I will have solved my problem, when in fact you haven't really understood your problem at all. And buying technology is only a waste of money and time, and your problem just continues to get worse because you haven't really solved it. So I would look at any discipline where there's an approach to understanding, what's the particular challenges that need to be addressed, and then being able to figure out how to find the right pieces of the puzzle to solve it. And again, I'm like standing on my soapbox here, but like the
Yeah,
people
I
that
told you it was going to be a tough question.
yeah, I
Yep.
mean, the people that I work with that I have the most respect for are the people who don't immediately try to engineer a solution, in the first meeting. They're the ones who sit back and they kind of listen, and they try to and they come back and they say, okay, here's what I think your problem is, and try to validate what they heard so that they can start formulating a strategy as opposed to throwing tactics at it right away. I'm guilty of that too. I always immediately start like, oh, okay, here's what we could do, as opposed to, wait, maybe I don't really understand what the issue is.
I heard a good analogy to that is, have you ever gone into a doctor's appointment, just sat down, and the doctor start telling you everything that's wrong with you and how to fix it? No, I mean, no doctor does that. They ask the questions. They learn about what the issues might be and past issues that you have and goals and things like that, and come up with a hopefully a good solution for you.
Or they prompt a chat bot and they ask it, okay, my,
Or
my
they
patient just told me all these things. Well, what's wrong with them?
Yeah, exactly. Well, David, one of the this is not going to be a surprising outcome, but one of the number one actually reported goal of AI for organizations within our survey was to see productivity gains. How can I know that for a lot of organizations, especially public organizations, short term is extremely important. They're judged by the quarter. But as far as AI is concerned, I think it's pretty obvious that the amount of money that's going into AI and getting your data ready for AI, no organization wants this to be just a short-term thing that they will see results from. How can they go from seeing results by quarters from AI to a longer term established, the AI is going to create XYZ percentage of productivity gains over the years? So basically, it's how can they go from a short term to long term? And that was
So
one of the biggest fears we had.
okay, here's the problem that I have with that, which is everybody's looking for productivity gains, meaning, can I get an AI to do something faster than a human will do it? And I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the best motivator, but rather, like, because I've talked to companies that are doing things like they're using AI to scan through medical histories to look for candidates for particular types of I'm being very general here, to look for candidates for certain types of medical protocols that try to make them you know address an illness better. Now, is that more productive? I don't know. I mean, if somebody came to me and said, based on your health history, we are going to recommend that you take these medications to prevent you from getting diabetes, that I wouldn't call that a productivity gain, but I would certainly say that there's a lot of value in that.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, I think the question is not, you know, can I, do something cheaper and faster that I'm doing now, but rather what are the things that I can't do now that I will be able to do using, artificial intelligence as an augmentation to the way we do what we do. So, you know, let's say we have a company that sells televisions. I can look for AI that will help me sell televisions faster, or and that'll maybe give me, a slight increase in my company's market share. Or I could use AI to come up with a completely different way of providing, streaming content that is much more appealing to people than the traditional, screen that you sit in front of and eat popcorn in front of, which might create a whole new market that I can corner the market on. So which one is better? To me, it's not necessarily productivity. It's innovation and leveraging the technology to help me change things instead of, like I can do the same bad thing, faster, but it's still bad. Or I could
Yeah,
do I could find a better thing to do and do it in a way that nobody else does it. And to me, that would be what I would want my motivation to be. Maybe we
that
need to
makes
change the
complete
question
sense.
on the next survey.
Yes, I have to agree with you on that one. Well, David, we've been talking for about an hour now, so I'm going to end with this. What are you excited about as far as artificial intelligence is concerned? Or heck, anything that's related to our field, the IT space, software space. What are you excited about as we approach let's go with 2030s? What's that, about 4 years away come January? Yeah. What really interests you about everything that's going on right now and where we're headed?
I think there's a lot of concern about whether like I'll refer to an article headline that I saw today, which was, such and such a model, new version is dangerous because it's starting to create its own language. And there's this fear of like the technology, it's what is this? This fear of the invasion of the body snatchers, right? There's this fear that, or was that other movie, Wall-E, where like humans have devolved into, just couch sitting blobs that don't do anything because the technology does everything that needs to be done. Well, what we shouldn't be, abdicating our responsibility to saying, yes, we are building these things and they're going to take over our lives and make humans, the slaves of machines, but rather, what are things that we can do that we couldn't do before? And how do we do it in a way that is governed so that it's got, it abides by ethical, guidelines and does so in a correct way and it doesn't violate, doesn't harm people and doesn't, I think the opportunity here, the opportunity here is how do we operationalize AI governance so that we're partnering with these technologies instead of becoming their subsidiaries.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Well, David, that's it. Once again, we've come to an end of one of these surveys and our webinar after that. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate all your insights. And to anyone within the audience viewing this webinar, Progress looks forward to any questions that you might have. Feel free to contact us at any point, and we would be happy to discuss your AI strategy and your AI goals. And David, with that said, this ends this webinar, and I wish you a great night. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much.
Yep.